thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be with you in Copenhagen. Unfortunately, this year it is very sad I couldn't be there in person. I always get a lot of inspiration from being with you in Copenhagen. But hopefully next year we will have a better situation to meet personally. Anyway, as I said, I have to leave after my presentation, but I can take questions. I will speak half an hour and then I will take questions maybe half an hour. Because I have to prepare for another presentation. If you have noticed on my Facebook page, I'm involved in a major movement or development in Iraq, where we have now a youth, people organizing themselves not to make a regime change, but to join the Belt and Road and work with China. So this movement, they had no good idea about what is the benefits of working with China and what is the Belt and Road and how Iraq can benefit from that. So for a month now, I've been giving classes to these groups. Some of them have, like the one I'm talking to today, have 270,000 members. So I will do a live, because yesterday 2 breakthroughs happened. Is that the Iraqi parliament voted to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And also one of the major political and religious leaders in Iraq told the government that they have to reactivate the China-Iraq agreement, which has been frozen. So people in Iraq say, okay, who can tell us about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? And people say, okay, call Hussein Askary. So that's what I'm gonna do today, because it's quite optimistic situation. But I think, Tom gave a thorough briefing and fantastic overview of the developments in the United States and why both the United States and Europe should work with China and Russia to have economic development in more parts of the world, but also most emphatically inside the United States and Europe, because these two also need economic development today. But one thing we have learned from Lyndon LaRouche, or I learned from Lyndon LaRouche, is that when you try to address a problem somewhere in the world, as we discussed today, the situation in the US, but as the subject of my presentation on the hunger crisis in the world and the pandemic today, is that, LaRouche says you have to zoom out from this situation itself. And it's like when you do with Google Earth, first you find an area on the map which you're looking for, and then you zoom out and you see the whole planet. So you not only zoom out to see the whole planet, but you also look back into the entirety of the history of mankind, and then look to the future of mankind, or what should supposed to be the future of mankind. So it's like a string quartet where you keep all these factors in your mind. Each one of the players in the string quartet, they sound like they are playing their own notes, but then there are dissonances and there are consonances or harmony, and then you come to a solution afterward. But you have to keep all these factors in your mind when you discuss a specific problem. Yes, the United States, what happens in the United States affect the whole world. But I also have to argue that what happens in the world has to affect the United States. So that's where our role, so we are not Americans, but our role is to make sure that we present to the American people, but also to the European people. Honestly, I don't think Europeans are less ignorant than Americans about what's going on in the world, because the media here is completely full of false, fake news and disinformation. But we need to help people by bringing a view of the world which is completely different from what they get. So in that sense, our work, whether concerning the Belt and Road, or Africa, or the Middle East, and so on, should reflect this universality of the work we are doing. So if we go to the slideshow, Michelle.
Yes, I'm getting it ready.
Okay. So as you see in the first slide, many of you know I had in 2017, I and Jason Ross and other members of the Schiller Institute, we put together this report about extending the new Silk Road to West Asia, so-called Middle East and Africa. And it has a comprehensive report on not only what is going on, but also where Africa should go and also West Asia. So we have a whole chapter on the food situation in Africa and how Africa can not only feed itself, but feed other parts of the world. Because the tragedy is that 60% of the untouched arable land in the world, agricultural land, also has enormous water resources, is in Africa. So Africa can potentially be the breadbasket of the world in the future. But there are reasons why not only Africa is capable of that, but also the fact that we have a famine in many parts of Africa. Now, if you go to the next slide, which is the projection of the Belt and Road Initiative and also reaching Africa, we'll come back to that. But this is the image we have to have in our mind when we discuss the problem of famine in Africa. So the next slide is we have the what are called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. Now, there is nothing problematic. It is problematic, but for me, it's not a problem to talk about sustainable development as long as we understand sustainable development as the Chinese do, which means sustained development, which means you have to always continue increasing the living conditions of your population using science and technology to do that. That's how the Chinese understand sustainable development. That's why they played a key role in designating these 17 goals for the international community to achieve by 2030. Now, the number 1 and 2, which I call the Siamese twins, is poverty and hunger. So by 2030, we were supposed to eliminate poverty and hunger as the first priorities of the human community. The problem is that that did not happen. Actually, we went back, as the International Food and Agriculture Organization reported last year, is that we are actually on the opposite direction of achieving that goal. Things are getting worse concerning poverty and hunger in the world. Now, what are the problems? If you look at the next slide, you saw in the first slide, if you go back, it's very orderly. It says, number 1, eliminating poverty. Number 2, eliminating hunger. 3, achieving universal health care. Then we have, gender equality, of course, but then you have physical economic improvements that are needed, electricity for all, clean water, so on and so forth. But in the next slide, what I put there is it's the Europeans and Americans turned this whole concept into a game where you don't really know where the priority is. So what they did is that they mixed the whole bag, and then they came up with the idea that climate change, fighting climate change, is the priority for mankind. Because whatever you do to eliminate poverty and hunger, if you don't end the climate change crisis, you will have, you cannot solve hunger and poverty, which is a lie. So they made this a priority. They say there's hunger and poverty in the world because of climate change. And that's also a lie. The reason there is hunger and climate and poverty in the world is that we have had a policy of depriving people, especially in Africa, South America, and Asia, of scientific technological development to keep them under the control of the British Empire, the Anglo-American Empire, and their allies. And they use regime change. And this is one of the reasons we had this crisis in Africa becoming bigger, is because, for example, of the Obama-Biden NATO operation in Libya to destroy, kill the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, in 2011, and supporting terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, to take over the country. But what happened then is that you had weapons, which there were lots of weapons in Libya. They start spreading into all of Africa, especially in the Sahel region. And then we had new groups, terrorist groups developing like Boko Haram, and they wreaked havoc in all other parts of Africa. That was the policy from the Biden-Obama administration and NATO and the EU. And now what the discussions in Europe about Africa is, when people talk about Africa, or politicians or media talk about Africa, the only thing they want to talk about is immigration. What should we do to stop immigration from Africa? Instead of saying what are the reasons that people are leaving Africa. So, and then they blame, of course, African leaders for the disasters in Africa, which were created by Western institutions, including the IMF and World Bank, which have prevented Africa from developing. So if we look at the next slide, which is the World Food Program, World Hunger Map, it's called. You can Google it. It's called the World Hunger Map of 2000. This is 2019. And I just picked Africa here. I mean, the countries in yellow, there are improvements, but the more red, orange, red you get, the situation is worse. So the fact is that especially in Africa, the colors represent the number of people who are undernourished, who don't get enough food for the day to live a normal, productive life. And the dark red ones is that you have more than 35% of the population not getting enough food every day. Now, there's a special situation also for these countries, which I will come to, which they are the worst hit countries, like Chad, the Central African Republic, Southern Sudan, and the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo are in gray because there is no data for 2019. But these are the worst case scenario countries. So you go down to you have Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Zambia, Zimbabwe. Now, what is common among those countries is that they are landlocked. They don't have access to the oceans. Now, we will get back to this question, because what we want to discuss is how we solve this problem, because there is a famine in the world, which has been. The World Food Program director, Beasley, who the organization won the Nobel Prize, which is a good thing. He warned at the beginning of the Corona pandemic in March that we could have 300,000 people dying of hunger every day. So when he got the Nobel Prize, or the World Food Program got the Nobel Prize, he said this is happy and a tragic development, because we did not manage to get all the resources we needed to feed people. And now we have 7 million people already dead of hunger. And he pleaded to the world leaders, and including billionaires, to donate money to buy enough food urgently to solve that problem. And for the credit of the United States and the Trump administration, they actually financed 50% of the World Food Program operations, and they even increased it this year. But that's not the only solution. But the solution, as we wrote in an article which is in Executive Intelligence Review today, this week, myself and Marcia Baker, we have a 3-step solution we are proposing. One is the emergency aid, but that should include also with the food to bring seeds and fertilizers to the population so they can grow their own food. Number 2 is to open transport corridors to these landlocked countries quickly now. One thing we propose is that the US Army, NATO's military operations in Africa, which are many, and Russia and China and India's operations for peacekeeping in Africa, they should be used because the military has the highest levels of logistics, unfortunately for war. But these logistics can be used, transport by sea, by air, by land, organizing the soldiers to deliver the food, building camps, building shelters, building kitchens, field kitchens, so on. The military is capable of doing that, and therefore both NATO troops who are active in Africa and Chinese and Russian and Indian and other UN peacekeeping forces should coordinate to bring the food where it's needed quickly. So this can happen. The problem with historically with the aid situation is that nations have become dependent. Many nations, especially the countries outlined in the map, they have become dependent on aid. They've never been able to produce their own food. And that has to be reversed. By the way, the food aid is very, very expensive because the packaging, the organizing, the transportation, because you can, in these landlocked areas, you can only airlift food. And because there are no enough big airports in these areas who are rural areas, you don't have big airports to take large airplanes. So you have to put everything in small packages on small airplanes and fly them all over the place. This is the most expensive way of bringing food to people. So therefore, the lack of infrastructure should be addressed. So we do have to do the emergency aid now, but then already now we have to think about the next step and the next step. And the ultimate step, of course, is to build enough infrastructure so Africa can utilize these 60% of all the planet's agricultural land to produce food for themselves and for the rest of the world. So, and as we have argued many times, the Belt and Road initiative and what China has been doing in Africa is an excellent example that Europe and the United States should follow and work with China to do that, building railways, water dams, bringing electricity, roads, ports, building industrial zones to produce the tools that people will need. You cannot just import everything. You have to start to build industries to build and produce tractors in Africa, harvesters, all kinds of things. You have to create a capability to produce fertilizer. You need agricultural research centers in Africa to develop the agricultural sector, so on and so forth. So in that sense, the Chinese have discovered the clue, the key to the problem. I think we can skip the next slide, which I discussed the difference attitude between Europe and China. You know, Europe, they love to donate money for small projects, which lead nowhere because they consider Africa as a problem. The Chinese see Africa as an opportunity. In the next slide, with the Africa map and railway, we can see that the problem with Africa is that it has been for more than 200 years, 300 years, Europeans and now Americans, they only extract wealth from Africa. But Africa is not participating in any of the supply chains. They supply the raw materials and that's it. There's no development of that raw material in Africa. And then they have to buy the goods produced by the same raw materials by Europe and the United States and Japan with much more expensive for their own needs. And of course, they are not capable of that. Our solution is to integrate Africa with transport infrastructure so African nations can trade with each other, but also take advantage of their resources. In the next slide, we have the problem with trade in Africa. I think I have discussed this before. But then we go, I think we just go to the three bottlenecks of development, which the Chinese have identified. Slide number 12. It's important to understand the different attitude between China and Europe and the United States, but I'm not going to go through that. I have explained that in earlier times. But the Chinese managed to, as the Xi Jinping, the president, said in the China-Africa Cooperation Summit in Johannesburg, is that the problem with Africa is that you have three bottlenecks, which is the shortage of capital to finance economic activity, shortage of skilled labor, and lack of infrastructure. If we solve these problems, as we did in China, then we won't have a problem solving the problems of Africa. So the Chinese have provided to solve the shortage with capital. They have provided tens of billions of dollars in credits, loans, and grants to build railways, ports, dams, electricity grids, and so on and so forth for Africa. Concerning shortage of skilled labor, Chinese companies, unlike the mythology that Chinese companies, they bring their own workers, they bring out their own engineers, and the Africans don't participate. That's not true. They train Africans because the Chinese worker is expensive now. It's not like 30 years ago. So they train Africans. The number of African students studying in China, China has surpassed both the United States and Britain in the number of African students studying in their country. Only France is ahead of China because of France's colonial past and control in Africa. More students in Africa go to France now than to China, but in a few years, even France will be overrun by China and the number of African students studying in China. A lack of infrastructure, of course, we have discussed this thoroughly in our report, but also China's role is well known in building a number of railways. I'm going to discuss one of them in conjunction with the food crisis. But if we go to the slide number 15, which is an African plan for integrating all the African countries with highways. Now, the Chinese said we can do that, but with railways, high-speed rail, standard gauge rail, and this will connect all African countries. One of the first projects which was completed in 2016 was the Djibouti Addis Ababa Railway, which is in the slide number. Okay, we go back to the slide number 16, sorry. As I said, the problem with many of these countries, which are the most affected by hunger, these are landlocked countries. So they have very little connection to the rest of the world. Sending a container to, for example, Uganda or Rwanda and Burundi would cost twice or three times more than sending it to Kenya, Zimbabwe, or Nigeria, who have ports on the Indian or Atlantic Ocean. This is a physical reality that makes the cost of transport on very bad roads very, very expensive. So you add that to their ability to produce, so it's impossible. But in slide number 17, we take the example of the Djibouti Addis Ababa railway, which is 750 kilometers, and it was built in a record time, I think 2.5, 3 years. In 2015, there was a drought and there was a threat of famine in Ethiopia, like the historic ones we have heard about. But that did not happen because Ethiopia had developed an economic plan which had big focus on agriculture. The second is that this railway, which was still not completed, was put on emergency operation to bring food and fertilizers from Djibouti, because ships were waiting in Djibouti with food to go to Addis Ababa, but trucks take 10 days in very harsh mountain terrain, quite costly. So they started loading the trains with both food and fertilizers to Addis Ababa and from there to the national grid. So that prevented a real famine from taking place. Now the same railway is being used for export of specific food which Ethiopia can produce, not grains. Ethiopia and Africa still are the world's biggest importers of grains like wheat, corn, rice, and so on. But this railway helped prevent a famine. In my article, which I mentioned, which is in Executive Intelligence Review, I have a couple of studies I looked at. One of them is a scientific study on the impact of the shutting down of the old railway on agriculture in Ethiopia. And it was a disastrous thing. there was an old railway, but it was still functioning. It was used for import of fertilizer, which is the most important item for the farmers. And shutting it down in 2009, a scientific study of 190,000 farmers showed that there were catastrophic results. So that's the importance of the infrastructure for food security. So anyway, this is a proof of the way to go. I mean, China does give aid to Africa. It's the second largest aid giver to Africa after the United States. But what they're doing simultaneously is the long-term solution. Well, it's medium-term, but also long-term solution. So Ethiopia now is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. This year, they were hit also by the locust plague, which also destroyed a lot of agriculture, but it's not like a complete famine and people are dying every day. They are still managing. So in the same time, Ethiopia is building industrial zones, this is a map of the different industrial parks they are building in, and China is the #1 investor there. They have different kinds of industries to put their young people into employment. But then the next step is to go from Ethiopia and Kenya into the Great Lakes region, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then continue all the way to the other side, to West Africa, to connect East and West Africa, and bring the countries in the middle, the landlocked, countries into the this economic process. I'm sorry, I have had a cold for some time, so my throat is not yet. So in that sense, Africa can, in the medium and long term, solve this problem. The technology to do that is available. We don't have problems. The projects we have identified, the African Union have identified, but China alone cannot do the job of building all this infrastructure. Remember, Africa 3 times larger than China. Then you can fit China, India, Western Europe, and the United States all together inside Africa. And Africa's population will grow. It's now 1.3 billion, but by 2050, it will grow to 3 billion people. So we need to have some long-term development plans. We have to connect the rivers and lakes of Africa for transport, as Europe did. We have to solve the problem with the Lake Chad, bringing water from the Congo to the Lake Chad, which has been drying. More than 30 million people live directly from the water. But with the Transaqua, we can create new agricultural lands and industrial activities and connect East and West Africa going through the Congo, where this canal will go. We need to build hydropower on the Congo River, on the Nile River, on the Niger River, on the Zambezi River. Africa's potential from only hydropower is enormous. It's not tapped yet. So putting together this whole perspective, which we presented, or LaRouche movement has presented, can put Africa on a completely different path. And the proof of what Africa can achieve is already in China. China in 30 years managed to bring 800 million people out of poverty. This year, 2020, the last few millions of Chinese who are under the poverty line will be pulled out, which the Chinese are very proud of. So we can do these things. The Chinese president told the Africans in this summit I mentioned, you have all the potential to do what we managed to do. There's no problem, and we should work together. But that's why Europe and the United States should join China in doing that. And the Africans, they do have their own plans for development, like the 2063 plan. And also, so it's not that China is coming to the Africans and telling them what to do. The Africans know what is needed. They know the impediments to their development. But instead of going to Africa and telling them, they should solve the problem with immigration, with the corruption, with human rights, with women's rights, children's rights. Those women and children, they should get an education, they should get water, power, and have an education in order to get out of that problem. So the European attitude and American attitude in Africa, including the idea that Africa, you just extract resources outside, should stop. And Africa's resources should be shared with the rest of the world, but Africa should get something back to be able to develop itself, but also to be able to, to feed itself. So finally, as I usually use this map, as LaRouche said, it's the future which determines the present. Our vision of the future shows us the way how we can do things today. And if this is our vision of Africa and in the world, then our attitude, our way of thinking, our way of doing things will change. So that's, I think, in brief, my contribution. I'm sorry, my throat is aching, but I am willing to take any questions from you.
I can start with a question. Why hasn't Europe and the United States done this, joined with this, and what do you think needs to be done to make that happen?
Well, we have had a cultural paradigm since at least the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but it had already started after World War II with the destruction of classical culture in the United States and Europe, the reversal of whatever Franklin Roosevelt did and his policy for the post-World War period, that nations will be sovereign and we will use what we have learned to do in the United States itself, increasing the power of the productivity of labor, using scientific and technological progress, and have a completely idea about relations among nations. But that was destroyed in the so-called Cultural Revolution, which followed the assassination of President Kennedy. And we had a totally different paradigm in the United States and in Europe, where people started going against, and this is as documented by Executive Intelligence Review. This was an intentional operation by British and American intelligence agencies and the City of London in collaboration with Wall Street, is to brainwash the American and European people that scientific and industrial development has its limits. We cannot continue like that. We have to live in so-called harmony with nature. And people became antagonistic to scientific, technological, and cultural development. And that was used as a way of neutralizing the movement, which was in the post-World War, that said, to implement what Franklin Roosevelt had intended to do. So the whole cultural paradigm shifted. And with that, since 1971, with the end of the Bretton Woods system, we had a shift also in the economic thinking away from investment in infrastructure, industry, science, into investments in financial markets to make quick profit. So this has become the trend. But that has, as everybody can see from the conditions in the United States and Europe, is self-destructive. But the impact on the rest of the world has been that Africa until today cannot grow its own food. We have famines, we have civil wars, we have wars in West Asia, the Middle East, by the same forces who wanted to prevent economic and cultural development in the United States and Europe and around the world. So there's a paradigm, a cultural paradigm, an economic paradigm, which started in the 70s that now have reached its end. And the people who are clinging to that old paradigm, to the empire, to control people and control resources in the world, they realize that their system is ending, but they keep hanging to it, whatever the price. If you instigate civil wars, world wars, it doesn't matter. The important thing is to save their system. But that's not going to happen so easily, because there is a whole new trend around the world, which is what Helga Tsepp-LaRouche has called the new paradigm, which China, Russia, until recently India, the BRICS nations were leading, and with them you have many, many nations in Asia, in Africa and South America have joined that new paradigm where they say the relations among nations should not be based on this extraction of wealth, but on what the Chinese call win-win. You get the resources you need for your development, but you give us the tools, the technologies that we need for our own development. And that's an equitable relationship among nations. This should be the standard for world governance. And that's the trend which is going on in the world. It's unstoppable unless the British Empire and its supporters in the United States start a world war, because there's nothing else that can stop it. It's very popular, it's very effective, it's very productive. So that old paradigm has to be shifted.
There's a question from Karl Oka from Sweden. Does China have a priority plan in terms of stages of infrastructure development in Africa?
I am not familiar with a grand design for specific projects, how these will happen. But the Chinese Prime Minister, when he came to Africa in 2014, he made a tour in different countries in Africa, East and West, and pledged that China is willing to connect all the African capitals with high-speed railway. So that's their vision. But then the Chinese, they don't work, they pay much attention to the idea of a sovereign nation. Yes, Africa works within the African Union, but the African Union is not like the European Union, where nations have lost their sovereignty. African Union, you still have sovereign nations. But the Chinese work with sovereign nations. They work with Egypt, they work with Ethiopia, they work with Nigeria, and so on and so forth. And each nation has its priority projects, and they present these priority projects to China, and the Chinese say, we can do this, we can do this, we can do that. And then they may go to the next stage. So the Chinese don't have a grand design for others. They say, whatever you take as your priority, we are willing to work with you. If it's reasonable, if it's productive, if it's win-win. But the Chinese also know that they have to diversify their markets. They cannot rely only on the United States and Europe for the political reasons we know. So therefore they are developing a market in Africa for high value products, not small products, which they can just overwhelm Africa with, but they want to go to higher value chains, like building factories in Africa. Chinese companies in China will build the factories which will produce the consumer goods for Africans inside Africa. So that's a completely different level of trade or economic relation with other nations. They will build, like the agreement with Egypt to build the high-speed railway. Part of the agreement is that trains will be produced in Egypt. So the Chinese will build a train factory inside Egypt for the trains that will run in Egypt. So the Chinese workers and engineers at home, they will be working with much, much higher value products than producing toys, which the Chinese used to do before. Now China has moved somewhere else. And therefore they are moving the supply chains and the value chains outside of China to other countries where there are advantages like closeness to markets, closeness to raw materials, and the availability of labor. So that's what the Chinese think about. But in terms of the specific projects on the continent of Africa, they leave it for the African nations and the African Union to define their priority projects. And then the Chinese, they say, well, we can build this railway, we can build this dam, we can finance it. So the Chinese thinking is not like European thinking. You make a plan for another nation. That's not our business. Because the Europeans and Americans think they know better what is good for Uganda. They know better what is good for Iraq. They know better what is good for South Africa. That's not true. The South Africans and Iraqis and Ugandans know better what is good for their country. And they do have capable people who can understand reality and define their priority projects. And that's what the Chinese, that's why the Africans like working with the Chinese, but because they respect them. They don't dictate to them what to do.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's Peter. Could you say something, Hussein, about this issue of asserting sovereignty? Because it's clear that there are, the British Empire, old British Empire, sort of financial center and the whole thing that goes with it, that they're not interested in having this kind of development policy for the African continent, for example, or for any nation. So they will like manipulate their currency through speculation, or you have maybe terrorism or assassinations and things like that, which is in order to prevent this kind of development from happening. But what is the how to put it? The nations themselves. What is their how can they assert this sovereignty in a better way than they're doing now, or is it even possible for them? Like, for example, you have written about creating a national banking institution, and I think you wrote something about Egypt and an emergency economic reorganization there. Can it be done in one nation, or does it have to be done with the African Union and China, or how do you look at this question?
No, the idea of sovereignty, national sovereignty, terrifies the British and their Wall Street collaborators. I mean, you always notice, and also it's in the mindset. It's like when you have these advertisements for aid to Africa, you never hear where those kids in the video, in which country they are. They're just Africans, they're Black kids. So you are never told that, okay, we're gonna work with these people in this African country. No, they say they're hungry people in Africa, send us some money. So they completely ignore the fact that you have a nation there with a government, with borders, with regulations, with rules. No, there's only a people. And also when you have people talking about the Russians, the Belarusians, the Iraqis, the Iranians, Pompeo talks about the Chinese, he says, we have to care about the Chinese people. We have concerns for the Chinese people. Well, the Chinese people have a government they love. So they want always, even in the dialogue, in the way they talk, they want to push aside the idea that there's a nation there. They say a people, there's a people. It's like the Trump administration plan for the Palestinians. Say there's a Palestinian people. We care about the Palestinian people. But there's no Palestine. There is no state called Palestine, and it should never be a state called Palestine. So that's a problem, because why? Because sovereign nations can decide suddenly, we don't want you here. Look, this Djibouti, one of the smallest countries on the planet. They had leased their port, the Durale port, a container port, which is very, very important for Ethiopia, to the Dubai World Ports, a company which is not really just from the Emirates, it's British control. So the Djibouti, the government changed. Now Djibouti doesn't even have an army. There are 7 superpowers who have military bases in Djibouti. First and foremost, the French and the Americans and the British, but even the Japanese, the Italians, and the Chinese have. But Djibouti decided, no, this is our port. You got this lease in a corrupt way. You bribed the minister to take over our port. We're taking that port from you. So what ports did, they went to London to an arbitration court, and the arbitration court said the Dubai ports have right, give them back their port. And then the Djibouti government told the British court to go to hell. And now they have a contract with a Chinese company to run the place, but without taking over the port the way. So this is what terrifies the empire from the idea of sovereignty, because nations suddenly say, our own people's interests come first, not your financial interest, not the World Trade Organization, not the UN, not this and that. Our people come first. and the interest of our people. We are willing to work with you on equitable basis, but you don't impose things on us, including our currency, our banking system. Now, the problem is that most nations are still dependent on the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions. So they are incapable of, like Egypt, they didn't fully go with a national bank. While they were negotiating with the IMF and World Bank, they managed to get the people to do something amazing. When the president went out to the people and said, we're going to build the Suez Canal, we don't have any money. And as you know, our country is almost bankrupt. I want you, the Egyptian people, to raise the money for the new Suez Canal. In 1 week, Egyptians raised $8 billion. I was in Egypt and a banker told me we had to stay open during the night because the Egyptian people were taking their savings from their homes to stand in long queues to buy the certificates of the Suez Canal. This is what happens when you have a leadership which can inspire the people. $8 billion in 1 week. Egypt had been, before that, in negotiations for 3 years to get $3 billion from the IMF. That's the difference between a sovereign nation and a nation which is enslaved by international institutions. And the Chinese, and now the Russians, are very, very aware of that principle. They want this to be the #1 issue in their dealings with everyone. So that's terrifying for the City of London and the Wall Street gang, and also for NATO forces who think the whole world is an open place for their tanks and airplanes and soldiers to walk in. Sorry, that's not happening. It's not going to happen.
There's a question from Ulf and about vaccine distribution in Africa, which he can say, but I would ask you in your answer if you can also bring in Helga's proposal for establishing a committee of the coincidence of opposites. So Ulf, go ahead.
Yes, great to be with you. So this is a question about the Chinese proposal. There was a very interesting Chinese article about the distribution of vaccines that is about to take place when the vaccines are ready. This will be a giant distribution of millions and millions of vaccine doses to all kinds of nations that will need it. And especially it will be a very challenge to bring it into Africa. And of course, Denmark with its huge pharmacy industry will be very important and possibly take part in this, also with Maersk and the SAS, the Scandinavian airline system, will be quite important too, because they are very poor now. They're almost struck to the ground now because of the COVID crisis, but they can be put into use in this airlift that will be organized. And we in Sweden, we have, of course, the Electrolux company, which is a company producing refrigerators. And the main thing about bringing the vaccines all the way into Africa will be to have a cool chain, a chain of distribution points where you always can keep the vaccines between, 3 and 8 degrees. So it is like in a refrigerator, and they're not destroyed. So this will be a big challenge to bring this about. So it is part of the idea of course, bringing the food to Africa, but it's also the idea of bringing the health Silk Road. It's as one part of that health Silk Road is, of course, to have a system of promote the vaccines. So it will be something that is now is coming up now in the next weeks, and it could be pushed here in Scandinavia that we really join this and support this. So I would like to know if you have studied this article about the the Chinese article about the distribution of vaccines that is now about to be organized?
Unfortunately, no, I haven't had the time to read it, but I can imagine that this, not simply getting the vaccine, but delivering the vaccine to people, this is going to be one of the biggest logistical operations on the planet. So I can imagine that the difficulties involved in that and also the potential, but if we have such initiatives, of course it's useful, but to have refrigeration, you need also to have electricity. So it's a race against time to get things fixed in a way. That's why this question of aid doesn't really always help to solve problems, because you hit such physical boundary conditions like electricity, where if it's not available, everything you do is useless. So it's like, it reminds me of President Obama's proposal to give every African child a computer. You know, most African children don't have electricity, so they ended up sending them toys that look like computers.
Yes, actually, the Emirates, big airline company, they are in the middle of this plan now to organize the distribution of these vaccines according to this article. And this will be something that also the Scandinavian airline system, SAS, could be taking up. And of course, it would be something that could be, with the support of the governments of Scandinavia, they could be pushed into this, and we could take part in this and make a big start in this plan, what Helga is discussing, the Feeding Africa, and also organizing this initiative that she's promoting, the coincidence of opposites, that is coincidentia oppositorum, which is she's proposing.
Yes, it will be a big, it will be a very important operation to involve the Scandinavian countries and Europeans in something which is real. You know, saving lives, doing logistics, and so on and so forth. As you know, Sweden stopped, the Swedish aid organization, they stopped giving development aid. But 3 years ago, they only supply aid to human rights organizations to stir problems against their own government. So this would be like a fresh approach to teach people that, you know, people need to have food and medicine, but to have food and medicine, you have to have infrastructure. And that can awaken in people a sense of reality rather than the fantasy we have painted in the media.
Yeah, I think we have to go beside the Danida and the SIDA policies, as you explained. The Swedish SIDA is not sending not one thing, not one piece of food or piece of equipment or anything from within their own organization. They've outsourced the whole thing to these other organizations, these NGO organizations, some of them UN organizations actually. So it's actually, they don't even have a rescue organization. So I think it's right, as you say, we have to go beside them and to go directly to the industry and have the government work with the industry to ask that the industries ask the government for money to do these things, like the pharmacy companies and the other companies that I mentioned.
Yeah, concerning the other question on the coincidence of opposites, I think this is a wonderful concept. I think Helga is the best person to explain it, but it comes from her understanding of the work of Nicholas of Coos in his the Pace Fide, the On Peace of Faith, and that wonderful dialogue. I mean, the time it was written is when the Ottomans had just invaded Constantinople. And there were people in the church and in Europe who were obviously calling for a new crusade war against the Muslims. But he realized that this will just end up in total butchery and bloodshed. So this wonderful dialogue, he brings in people of all kinds of faiths, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Greeks, atheists, okay, in order to bring into the discussion what is human, what is universal. So they end up by discovering that what unites humankind is the love of truth, the love of wisdom. And that's what is the gift of the creator to all humankind. All humans are capable of reason, of rational thinking, of discovering truth and beauty. And I think Helge's proposal will solve some of the most problematic, some of the, Ulf, you can unmute yourself if possible.
Sorry.
Some of the most dangerous things we see today, which the British and their friends in the United States, like Pompeo, are pushing. It's a clash of civilization. Like even now Pompeo went to Indonesia to arouse the feelings of Muslims against China, calling for a new jihad against China because the Chinese are oppressing the Uyghurs in Western China. This is the stuff World Wars is made of. So instead of doing that, and also, following the example of Nicholas of Kuz, is what Helge is proposing is that, and also it exists in the Chinese tradition. It's called the I Chi, not yin yang, but it's a Confucian concept which says when two opposite forces cannot reach an understanding, end up in a conflict here on questions like today, human rights, culture, ethnic questions, sexual questions, so on and so forth, they have to abandon this fight and go up here to find what is common, not where they are opposing each other. They have to abandon the issues that create the conflict and try to reach up here to find what unites the two parties. And in that sense, you get to the idea of universality, where each nation, what do each nation need? What do each nation, each family, each human need as a human? And then find a solution on the basis of the common points, the commonalities, rather than going on head to head on things we disagree on. I think this is, in a simplified way, is the concept Helge is pushing, but it goes much, much deeper than that. But for the world today, we need to have that approach. You cannot impose your political, cultural, religious, sexual, and other preferences on other nations. That's their own business. This is also the message the Chinese carry to Africa, because one of the criticisms of China in the West is that when the Chinese go to an African country, they build projects, but they never discuss the corruption, the human rights abuse, and so on in that country. The Chinese say, this is not our business. We are here to improve the living conditions. We know that's something positive. This is something that can improve your living conditions and eventually lead to solving all these other problems. No, Europe and the United States, no. You have to fight corruption. Well, corruption was created by people who worked for the United States and Europe. You have to fight this, you have to fight that. So instead of going and doing the things the African nations need, infrastructure, water, power, education, healthcare, and then discuss the other issues we disagree on. But they go and say, we disagree on this and that, which is a lot of hypocrisy. As I mentioned, the fact that one of the biggest crises in Africa was created by the Obama, Biden, and NATO and EU by invading Libya. Now, Libya is a big slave market. Now, they say we are against slavery. We have to stop the slavery. Well, you created the conditions for the slave market. You made it possible by going to this, using this question of human rights to destroy the sovereignty of a nation. So that's, I think, a perfect approach today to respect the differences among sovereign nations, differences in culture, social systems, political systems, religious belief, and so on. That these don't become the issues of dispute and negotiations and discussions. What should be the issues for discussion and negotiation is what do we do to lift humankind into the next level, into the next platform of economic development and social and scientific and cultural development. And that's, I think, is a priority. I think it's a genius idea which Helga brought. I think it will be very popular in most parts of the world. And we have to fight to make people in Europe and the United States to understand they are not the best kids in the class. You don't have the highest levels of culture in the world. You don't have the highest moral. Like here in Sweden, people started calling Sweden a moral superpower. Sorry, you are not a moral superpower. Look in the mirror. So therefore, we have to stop that kind of nonsense and start working with other nations on concrete solutions for the world's problems.
Great. Are there any other pressing questions? If not,
I have one more general.
If it's, yeah, short question, short answer.
Okay. It's also for Tom, it's for both of you, whoever wants to answer. You know, we're not sure what time, when the economic collapse is going to happen. It's difficult to say, but short question. Are we, what kind of people do we have? Like, are there any moral bankers left in the West, or other contacts that would be able to sort of get together and already begin to put out a proposal for reorganizing the system? I don't know how to put it, but I mean, Lynn has written a lot and we have put out a lot of things, but is there more concretely like discussion groups here and there, or people we're in touch with who could create, who could be part of such a group? Would that be an idea for already now before the collapse happened, or what? Okay. Do you know what my question is?
Yeah. I can just give a short question generally, but Tom and Ulf, others who know more about the kind of people working in Denmark. But I think it's not the lack of people. It's the environment which is created, which makes the bad guys be on the top. So an environment is created where monetary and financial value is the primary source of wealth. So the guys who only know how to manipulate financial and monetary markets, they are now the Nobel Prize winners. They are in the central banks. They are the people you see on television, because an environment was created since the 70s promoting that kind of thinking. There are lots and lots and lots. Every time you create a new environment where you have a conference or discussion among real economists and financial people and banking people, you discover that they're morally, intellectually, scientifically on a completely different level than the common environment today. And we have many examples of this. I mean, I can only mention one I know, and it's the Daisuke Kotegawa from Japan. He is in a sense, a financial and banking guy. He worked in the IMF representing Japan. He knows all the dirty things that are done, but at the same time, he knows how to create the alternative. So there are people all over the planet, economists, bankers, and financial experts who have a different morality and scientific tendency than what is common. The problem we have is the environment. So we have to change the environment. It's like the global warming thing. We have lots and lots of scientists who say this global warming or homogenic climate change, like man, this is baloney. And we have scientists who do real scientific work who can prove that's not true, but they're not allowed into the environment today to say what they think. So not enough to find those people. You have to change the environment where this discussion is taking place. And the financial collapse will be such an event. But we have to separate also that we have to separate the financial sector, so the collapse of the financial sector does not destroy our physical economy. So there should be precautionary. You have to already educate the people in parliament, in the general population and others, that there is a solution, like the Glass-Steagall Bank Separation Act. They have to have that tool already available when that happens to protect society and the physical economy. So we don't wait until things happen. We put the brakes in, or the tools, we give people the tools to deal with that, such an eventuality.
I just want to add that how not to do it is seen by how the Trump administration has been functioning. Because
Tom, du må gerne tale dansk.
Aha. Jeg vil sige, et eksempel på, hvordan man ikke gør det, det kan man se på, hvordan Trump-administrationen har fungeret de sidste 4 år. Han blev valgt med et mandat på at skabe forandring, på at dræne sumpen, på at tage et opgør med de korrupte institutioner i Washington. Og på den måde havde han et mandat, lige det som Franklin D. Roosevelt havde, da han blev præsident, og kom ind under kritiske omstændigheder, mens at USA's banker var bankerot og gik ned og så videre. Det Roosevelt gjorde under de omstændigheder, var, at han havde lederskab. Han havde en idé om, hvordan gør man det her. Og så hentede han simpelthen en masse unge mennesker ind fra rundt omkring, ikke bare fra USA, der var også nogen fra Canada, der var unge lysehoveder, som havde en vis kompetence, ja, men frem for alt var de unge og i stand til at tænke nyt. Og så satte Roosevelt dem ellers i gang. Så satte han team sammen, og så sagde han så, det vi er ude efter er følgende. Den her retning. Ikke det, som de nuværende eksperter render rundt og snakker om, fordi det er det, der har kørt det hele i sæk. Nej, vi skal have noget helt andet i den her retning. Og så begyndte man ellers at arbejde i samarbejde med administrationen. Hvordan kan vi skabe noget helt nyt? Hvis man ser på, hvordan Trump har fungeret, jamen så på alle de her områder, altså han skulle have renset ud i efterretningstjenester. De var alle sammen dybt korrupte, de var alle sammen dybt involveret i hele kuppet imod ham. CIA, FBI, NSA og så videre og så videre. Så skulle han have taget nogle folk, der ikke var en del af apparatet, ind for at rense op. Så kunne der have taget nogle whistleblowers, som Bill Binney og andre, som ved, hvordan det fungerer, så de kunne gå ind og rense op. Og så, når man havde renset op, så kan man så finde nogle folk på et lavere niveau i de her organisationer, der måske ikke er helt så korrumperet, og der kan du så sætte dem til at administrere det. Med økonomi, samme sag. Du kan ikke bare, altså i dag, når man skal finde folk til at gøre ting, så siger man, at vi skal have nogle økonomiske eksperter. Og så tager man folk, der er en del af problemet, og sætter dem til at køre det her. Og så får man en mærkværdigvis ikke nogen forandring. Så du er tvunget til at have lederskab i form af, at du har nogen, som har en vision, som har en idé om, hvor vi skal hen. Som har en idé om en anden vej. Og har man ikke nogen af dem, så kommer man til Schiller Instituttet, så kommer man til os og henter dem, fordi vi er det. Vi repræsenterer det. Tag folk fra vores organisation i USA, og det er en garvet garde efterhånden med grå hår og så videre. Det er virkelig det grå guld. Tag nogle af dem, sæt dem ind og sige, hvordan gør vi det her? Og så tag en masse lyse hoveder, en masse unge økonomer, som stadigvæk har evnen til at måske at tænke nyt. Og så sammensætter man simpelthen et nyt team og et helt nyt program. Og det er det Trump ikke har evnet at gøre. Det er derfor, vi er i så store problemer nu. Fordi hvis han havde drænet sumpen, hvis han havde renset op i efterretningstjenesterne og alt det her, hvis han havde sørget for, at de folk, der brød forfatningen igen og igen, inklusive i kampagnen for at afsætte ham, at de var blevet stillet til ansvar for det, og de sad bag lås og slå i dag, så kan jeg garantere for, at vi ikke havde set den valgsvindel, vi har set lige nu. Fordi så vidste folk, at det har konsekvenser. Bryder man loven, så ender man i fængsel, så det skal man nok lade være med. Og det er jo så der, hvor man kan se i det nuværende, også den meget dramatiske situation i USA, at det er skræmmende, men det er måske også det, der skal til i form af, at der skal noget nyt til, der skal en anden form for lederskab. Og hvis det er sådan, at man faktisk kæmper sig igennem det her, så står man et helt andet sted. Det er givet. Hvis det er sådan, at man faktisk tager opgøret med den enorme valgsvindel, vi netop har set, så er det en helt anden Trump-administration, vi vil se komme ud på den anden side. Men det kræver, fordi det kræver noget andet, det kræver noget mere, det kræver noget større. På samme måde. I USA er der rigtig mange mennesker, som har gået hen til det her valg og sagt, nu giver jeg min stemme, og så har jeg gjort mit til, at vi får en forandring. Men sådan spiller klaveret ikke i den virkelige verden. Det er ikke nok at gå hen og stemme. Du skal også beskytte din stemme. Du skal også sørge for at følge projektet til dørs. Det er ikke nok at afgive din stemme. Det er nødvendigt, at en tilpas stor mængde af de amerikanske borgere tager et virkeligt ansvar for deres land. Inklusive det intellektuelle ansvar af at vide, jamen, hvad skal man så gøre i stedet for? Og der igen er vi nøglen, fordi vi er i stand til at faktisk kunne være den skattekiste af kundskab om ikke bare praktiske løsninger på praktiske problemer, men via Lyndon LaRouches arbejde. Hvordan skaber man helt nye løsninger til helt nye problemer? Hvordan tænker man, hvis man vil være i stand til at løse problemer, som man ikke engang aner eksisterer i dag? Og det er det, som er så utrolig spændende lige nu. Altså i USA, hvis der var noget tidspunkt, hvor en meget stor del af befolkningen er blevet smerteligt erindret om, at de er tvunget til at gøre mere, end bare at gå hen og stemme, hvis de vil have en forandring, så tror jeg faktisk, det er nu. Og det kan der komme ufattelig meget ud af. Men det kan også sagtens være tilfældet, at vi ved jo, at efterretningstjenester vil gå ind og forsøge at sørge for, at måden det her skal håndteres på, det er ved at manipulere grupper på hver side til at gå ud og slås med hinanden på gaderne, ligesom man så det i Weimar, Tyskland for eksempel. Så det er en meget, meget potent situation, vi er i USA. Men på den måde er USA egentlig også bare en repræsentant for det, der i virkeligheden er tilfældet verden rundt, hvor det er jo det dilemma, som er i alle nationer, at det er klart, at den kurs, som magten har, ikke løser problemerne, men bare skaber endnu større og katastrofale problemer. Og det fornemmer folk, der skal noget andet til, men det er jo så der, hvor vi har det samme grundlæggende spørgsmål. Er der af såkaldte almindelige mennesker, folk som ikke er groomet i systemet og derfor er systemets repræsentanter, der er villige til at tage ansvar for deres nation, der er villige til at tage ansvar for menneskeheden, som er villige til at dedikere sig selv til noget mere end sin egen private lykke, sin egen private bekvemmelighed. Og det er det, der er mirakel. Det er hver gang det kommer i spil, det er hver gang der er mennesker, der dedikerer sig selv til menneskehedens fremtid. Det er der, hvor vi ser revolutioner. Ikke, det er der, hvor vi ser gennembrud i videnskab. Det er der, hvor vi ser kunstnerisk genier, som en Beethoven eller en Mozart, eller hvad det måtte være. Og det er det, der har virkelig menneskelighed. Og det er det, som er den virkelige joker i den nuværende situation. Hvor meget kommer det i spil?
Okay.
Guys,
Hussein, thank you.
Thank you
very much, Hussein.
Thank you too. I'm happy to be with you, but as I said, time limits.
Right.
To have Arabic speaking people, they can go to my Facebook page at 5 o'clock today, there will be this live webcast. And also I have offered all Arabic speaking people the Arabic translation of the New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. The Arabic translation is now for free. So people can download it from the Arabic LaRouche School for Physical Economics. So I have links to that in my Facebook page.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.